The question of what is philology, what is a philologist, what kinds of things does this person have to know, I think is perhaps answered with difficulty even by people who study medieval literature. But I think I would be harder pressed, Professor Fulk, to find a better qualified person to answer that question. What does the philologist need to know?
Well, you're right. There's no general agreement about what philology is and what exactly you need to know to be a philologist. Because philology is, well, it's practiced different ways in different disciplines, not with a great deal of difference, but with enough differences that makes it very hard to define as a discipline as a whole. I made an attempt to define it about 10 years ago. I call it an aggregate of the various modes of inquiry required for the editing of texts in extinct languages. And that, I suppose, stems from the original purpose of philology. I mean, it was in order to, the 19th century philologists wanted to edit texts and to examine texts in detail. And so it makes sense that the original purpose of philology should still, to a great extent, be able to um, determine what we mean by philology. At any rate, it is still true today that philologists in Germanic studies uh, need to know many of the same things that philologists in the 19th century knew, and which they considered the basis of philology. So, for instance, there is, I suppose, the most basic thing is manuscript studies, which involves a number of different branches, including paleography. Um, uh, some some writings some writing systems are very easy for moderns to read, and others are not. Old English, for instance, is fairly easy to read, in part because there's a few abbreviations in Old English manuscripts. I'm not sure why that is. It may be that the ecclesiastics um, who made manuscripts in Anglo-Saxon England had plenty of time on their hand and plenty of sheep to skin. It's making books is a time-consuming process. On the other hand, if you look at Old Norse manuscripts, you'll see they're very full of abbreviations, and it's important that you be able to distinguish one abbreviation from another. So, for instance, the differences among the abbreviations for AR, UR, and IR determine the case of a noun, for instance. And so you need to know those things. Um, Another aspect of manuscript studies is um, codicology, the making of books. This is not important, I think, as paleography, but it does make a difference in some instances. Some scriptoria and some national practices in terms of how you make a book will help to determine the age of a manuscript and its provenance. Um, um, so it's important to pay attention to the way a book has been put together. Another aspect, even more important, is stematics. That is the study of how manuscripts are related to one another. And this is done by examining, chiefly by examining the variant readings in the different manuscripts and figuring out how they're related to one another, and how you get from one stage of a text to another stage of a text. And that results, of course, in the construction of something like a family tree for a group of manuscripts containing a particular text. Another aspect of philology that is important is the study of orthographic systems and scribal habits. This includes, I suppose, not just manuscripts, but for instance, objects inscribed with runes in Old Norse studies, which can be portable, or they can be stone. Another aspect of this is orthography, which is the relationship between spelling and pronunciation. Of course, it is also important to have a firm grasp of poetic form, and this is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of Germanic philology, being able to master poetic form, because of course the early Germanic uh, uh, literary texts, poetic ones, are in a meter that um, is difficult for moderns to understand, in part because the early Germanic languages are rather different from the modern ones. The early Germanic languages, um, they, for instance, have um, um, phonemic vowel quantity and phonemic um, consonant quantity, and we don't have that, for instance, in modern English. And it makes a difference in terms of the analysis of the poetic meter, whether a vowel is long or short, and whether a consonant is doubled or not. Also, there's the matter of alliteration, um, which is not hard to master, but as I think we'll see a little later in this interview, alliteration can make a difference in terms of how you establish a text.
Right.
Um, in Old Norse studies, you have not only meter and alliteration, but also internal rhyme. And if you're an Old Norse scholar, you need to know what rhymes with what. um, let's see. There's also the matter of syntax. This is truer in Old Norse studies than in Old English studies, but you really need to have a grasp of what is possible syntactically in a language. Now, Old English and Old Norse are both synthetic languages. You understand the syntax by analyzing the inflections on the words, so that the syntax can be quite convoluted. But even in languages like these, there are limits on how convoluted the syntax can be. And, you need to be aware of the limits of that variability. You also need to be aware of poetic conventions when you're editing a poetic text. In Old Norse, particularly, this pertains to the use of heiti and of kennings, which can be quite elaborate in Skaldic poetry, much more elaborate than the kennings in, for instance, Old English and Old Saxon and Old High German. And then, in addition to all this, um, you need to have a knowledge of the material and material culture out of which a text comes. Um, and I'll be able to illustrate this later. I guess the larger point here is that in order to be a competent philologist, or in order to be a very good philologist, you need to be aware of much more than just matters of language. One way of looking at philology is as the study of the context in which a text is found. And that context can be literary, it can be linguistic, it can pertain to material culture. So in a sense, a philologist has to be a jack of all trades, looking into so many different aspects of the culture out of which a text comes. Do you have any questions about that?
No, that makes sense. I think a lot of people associate philology with J.R.R. Tolkien, and a lot of people have read his valedictory address where he discusses the sort of breaking apart of linguistics and literary studies in English departments. And I think a lot of people think of that, but it sounds like you're describing the kind of same thing that I think he was getting at, which is that a competent philologist needs to have mastery of both of those things. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. And in fact, if you go back and look at the 19th century journals that have some form of the word philology in their names, such as the Journal of English and Germanic Philology, or Neue Philologische Mitteilungen, or Modern Philology. In those 19th century journals, you'll find that literary studies and linguistic studies are intermixed very much. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that um, uh, linguistic studies in the 19th century were almost exclusively limited to diachronic studies. When linguists became more interested in synchronic studies, as they are today, that drove a wedge really between literary studies and linguistic studies. And likewise, the rise of British aestheticism in the late 19th century that paved the way for um, the focus of literary studies to be away from texts in extinct languages, so that even modern texts are become worthy of literary study. And um, philology is not as pressing a need in regard to many modern texts as it is to ancient texts.
Could you briefly define diachronic and synchronic?
Yes, diachronic refers to the study of language change over time, or
Mhm.
the earlier states of languages, whereas synchronic refers to the study of language in the present moment, or in the present moment. So, for instance, the methods of uh, these two types of approach to language can be quite different. So, for instance, if you're studying a modern language, you can tape record various informants and um, compile statistics about various linguistic features. Whereas if you're dealing with an ancient text, you can only reconstruct the pronunciation, and you have no native speakers to interrogate. So
Right.
obviously, the methods of the two approaches to language can be quite different.
You mentioned before when we were setting this interview up that you had materials to discuss relating to Skaldic poetry in the Scandinavian Middle Ages. Could you briefly describe, there's a website associated with this as well. It's a series of books, as I understand, your work pertaining to that.
Yes, this is commonly referred to as the Skaldic Project. It was initiated in the 1990s by a group of five Old Norse scholars, all women who refer to themselves at one point as the five learned ladies. The number of editors has now expanded to seven, and there are a couple of men on the board now. The purpose of the project is to re-edit the entire corpus of Skaldic poetry. Skaldic poetry, as you know, is the court poetry of the Scandinavian Middle Ages, although it was not composed solely at courts, mainly courts of Norwegian kings, but also you'll find it in the sagas of the Icelanders. Um, Icelanders dominated this genre, the Skaldic genre, in part because Icelandic is such a conservative language. Um, Norwegian, in Norwegian, the endings on words became reduced. You know, vowels would be reduced to schwa, and consonants might be lost, and consequently, the complex syntax of Skaldic poetry um, could not be reproduced in the Norwegian language at a certain point. Whereas in Icelandic, which retains these inflections to the present day, the syntax could still be entirely understandable because the endings are preserved on the words. So Icelanders dominated um, this genre. Well, at any rate, an Icelander living in Denmark by the name of Finnur Jonsson um, edited the entire corpus of Skaldic poetry in a couple of um, a couple of volumes. Actually, it amounts to four books, which were published in 1912 to I think it was 1916. Um, and it was a tremendous accomplishment at the time. There are so many manuscripts to be consulted, and not all of them are easily accessible. They may be in places far from Iceland and Norway. But he had assistants and used a representative uh, set of manuscripts for each poem, and managed to edit the entire Skaldic corpus. Um, and of course, today some aspects of this edition are no longer um, as widely regarded as once. For one thing, we now have the ability to examine all the relevant manuscripts to any text. If you go to the Skaldic Project website and look at the editions, you'll see that there are digital images of all the manuscripts consulted. Also, Finn Jonsson, like many of his contemporaries, felt that it was perfectly justifiable to alter the text in ways that were not supported by any manuscript evidence. There's plenty of conjectural emendation in Finnur's edition. And this is not the attitude of most Old Norse scholars today. Most Old Norse scholars now feel that we ought to stick as close to the manuscripts as possible when we're editing these texts. So there was some dissatisfaction with the standard edition of Skaldic poetry, and that's why the five learned ladies set out to create a new edition. We're now at the point that 6 of the 9 volumes have been published. We're hoping that the remaining volumes can be published within the next 2 years. One of the five learned ladies was my dear friend and closest colleague at Indiana University, Kari Ellen Gade. She died in 2022, and 2 years later, the Germanic Linguistics Annual Conference was held here at Indiana University. And the day before the Germanic Linguistics Conference began, there was an adjunct conference which was dedicated to the memory of Kari Gade. And there were a day's worth of papers devoted to subjects near and dear to her heart. I was asked to give the keynote address, and what I did in that address was illustrate some of the things that we've been talking about just now by taking examples out of the works edited in the Skaldic Project, mostly by Kari Gade herself, and illustrating the uses of philology and the different types of philology that go into producing an edited text. That keynote address was never published, and I thought it might be useful to illustrate the points we've been talking about here by reading some portion of that paper to demonstrate how a philologist such as Kari Gade goes about editing a Skaldic text, and so I'll turn to that now, and hope you won't mind that I'll be reading much of this instead
Oh,
of
no worries.
speaking off the cuff. What is the first thing to be done in undertaking an edition of the Skaldic corpus? First, it needs to be decided what is and is not Skaldic poetry. Matters would be simpler if modern scholars had not conflated, if modern scholars had not differentiated Skaldic poetry and Eddic poetry. Skaldic poetry, as I said, is the poetry of court poets, especially for Norwegian kings, but it was also the most elevated form for poetry in the Icelandic Middle Ages. Eddic poetry is the poetry of the poetic Edda and of certain other texts that are embedded in prose, mostly in Icelandic sagas. The two genres, Skaldic and Eddic, are not differentiated explicitly anywhere in Old Norse texts, although there's an implicit differentiation between them. So, for instance, Skaldic poetry is Eddic poetry is uniformly anonymous. Um, we just don't know who composed it, and it's often very difficult to determine when exactly it was composed. Skaldic poetry, on the other hand, is mostly attributed to specific skalds or poets. Um, and Skaldic poetry is also generally in different form from Eddic poetry. Eddic poetry is chiefly in a meter called Fortnirðislag, which means old story meter. Um, Although there are a couple of other Eddic forms as well. Um, the chief form of Skaldic poetry is a meter called Drókvætt, which is similar to Fortnirðislag, but it has a couple of extra syllables at the end of the line, and in addition to the requirements of meter and alliteration, there is um, internal rhyme in the line. So it's a more complex form than most Eddic forms. But the difference between the two in terms of form is not absolute, because there are some Skaldic poems that are actually in Eddic meters. Um, so, as I said, the two forms were not uniformly distinguished in the Scandinavian Middle Ages, and it's sometimes difficult to classify a poem, whether it's Skaldic or Eddic. But the Scandinavians themselves did regard um, the Skaldic form, the main Skaldic form, Drókvætt, as superior to the main Eddic form. And I can illustrate that with an anecdote. Rallying his men before the Battle of Stamford Bridge, King Haraldr Harðráði composed a stanza in Fornyrðislag, and then he said, "That stanza I just recited was not well made, and I will make another better one." He thereupon delivered a stanza in Drókvætt. So and scholars are not entirely mistaken to distinguish between Skaldic and Eddic poetry. It's just that um, it sometimes makes it difficult to determine what a Skaldic poem is. So there's inevitably some subjectivity involved in defining the Skaldic corpus of poetry. Yet even when the Skaldic and Eddic corpora have been differentiated, not infrequently there remains the problem of determining what constitutes a Skaldic poem, since manuscript versions may differ, and it is not always plain whether stanzas belong to the same composition or even to the same poet. Um, and I've put an example of this. What I'm illustrating here is how it is sometimes difficult to define a Skaldic poem or even to identify one. Um, this is a fragmentary poem by Einar Skúlason, in which Finnur Jónsson assigned the title Finnur Jónsson assigned the title Haraldssonarkvæði. The first stanza is ascribed to Einar Skúlason in manuscripts of Haraldssona saga in Heimskringla, which, as you know, is Snorri Sturluson's history of the world, or the world as he knew it. As I said, the first stanza is ascribed to Einar Skúlason, whereas the second, a half stanza, is ascribed to one Einar in manuscripts of Snorri Edda. In his edition of Snorri Edda, Jón Sigurðsson included in this poem two further half stanzas from Snorri Edda and Laufás Edda. And in his history of Old Norse literature, Finnur Jónsson included in this poem a stanza found in Haraldssona saga, which other editors have regarded as belonging to a poem about Sigurður Haraldsson. When Karigada edited this poem, she retained just the first two stanzas that I mentioned, as you can see here. And she accepted Finnur's proposed title, Haraldssonarkvæði, but placed a bracketed question mark after it. So, even defining what constitutes this poem can be difficult on the basis of the manuscript evidence. Editing a specific Skaldic poem begins with the manuscripts. There are more than 700 parchment manuscripts containing Skaldic poetry and more than 200 relevant paper manuscripts, along with 17 print sources of Skaldic poems not found elsewhere, and more than 200 poetic inscriptions. As a consequence, there are more than 28,000 images of poetic sources in the database of the Skaldic Project. The numbers alone inspire deep respect for Finn Jonsson, the sole editor of the edition that I described earlier. Although, to be sure, his employment of manuscripts was selective. By contrast, the manuscript work for the Skaldic Project is undertaken by its seven general editors and 50 contributing editors. Naturally, both Finnur and the editors of the Skaldic Project have benefited immensely from prior scholarship relating to the manuscripts, not least of all, in the latter case, the card index of Skaldic poems and their manuscript sources commissioned by Jon Helgason and preserved in the Arnamagnæan collection at the University of Copenhagen. Now, one of the fundamental tasks of manuscript work is establishing the manuscript stemma, or family tree, for any given text. In Old Norse studies historically, priority has generally been accorded manuscripts of parchment rather than paper, since the latter are post-medieval copies of earlier parchments. But certainly some paper manuscripts are of the first importance. There are prominent examples in the record of the King's Saga, such as the paper copies of the lost parchment Fagerskinna and its sister manuscript NRA 51 in the National Archives of Norway, reduced to one fragment by the Copenhagen fire of 1728. Also in relation to the King's Sagas, the paper transcripts of Kringla, a manuscript of Heimskringla, reduced to a single leaf by that same fire. On certain rare occasions, a Skaldic edition must adopt as its main source not a parchment or a paper manuscript, but a prior edition. An example of this is Jane Carroll's edition of the Eiríksdrápa of Markus Geirsson, in which the source for most of the preserved stanzas, those found in Knytlinga Saga, are derived from Jon Olafsson's 1741 edition of the saga, which is based on a paper manuscript made about 1700 by Árni Magnússon, a manuscript now missing chapters 3 to 82 of the saga, which is in turn a copy of a lost codex of about 1300. So the 1741 print edition, as you can see here, is indispensable to establishing this poem. In some instances, establishing the stemma is unnecessary, since the editor of an earlier edition has already done the work. If there is no pre-established stemma, one must be constructed, chiefly but not exclusively, on the basis of textual variants. For example, if we examine the textual variants in the first Lausavisa of Krókarevir from the saga of his name, we'll see that of the 5 manuscripts consulted in Karigada's edition, there are plainly 2 branches to the stemma. The manuscripts are these: parchment 8 quarto in the Royal Library in Stockholm, abbreviated 8 quarto, manuscript 552 F quarto, a paper manuscript in the Arnamagnæan collection, abbreviated 552 FX, X stands for paper, the manuscript 554H beta quarto, another paper manuscript in the same collection, abbreviated 554H beta X, and 2 parchments in the Arnamagnæan collection, manuscript 471 quarto, abbreviated 471, and manuscript 586 quarto, abbreviated 586. A glance at the textual variant reveals right away that there are 2 branches to the stemma. The variant mér, meaning to me, adopted in line 1 of the visa, is shared by the last two of these manuscripts, 471 and 586, while the other three manuscripts have Meir, meaning girl, a word which makes no sense in context. Likewise, the next word in line 1, the variant boil, meaning offered, adopted in Caragada's edition, is also shared by the two Arnhem parchments, while the other three manuscripts have bath, meaning asked, which likewise does not fit the context. So we'll treat these two parchments, 471 and 586, as constituting the right-hand branch of the stemma. We can see also that of the remaining three manuscripts, 8 quarto is the most reliable. The two paper manuscripts sometimes share an inferior reading with no other manuscript, as in line 1, where they have farar, meaning of a journey, for furar, meaning fire, of fire, though farar is unmetrical and spoils the sense. And so it is reasonable to suppose that the two paper manuscripts share an exemplar different from the direct exemplar of the other manuscript on the left branch of the stemma, 8 quarto, a lost sister of that manuscript. The resulting stemma is represented, as you can see at the bottom of the page, where we have two different branches stemming from the exemplar, hypothetical exemplar labeled X. Are there any questions at this point?
Yeah, so what this actually really makes me think of, I think most of my viewers will be most familiar with the Beowulf manuscript when we talk about manuscripts.
Yes.
And it's just so interesting to compare what we have here, where we have multiple manuscripts that can inform each other and we have to make decisions between them. Does this kind of induce any sort of anxiety when we move to scholarship on a poem that has one manuscript?
Yes, of course it does. Um, uh, we're all aware of how frequent scribal error is. And so, in a sense, textual conservatism would seem counterintuitive. Um, and Finnur Jonsson's approach to all of this, would seem preferable from that point of view. Um, of course, the fact that we have just one manuscript of Beowulf is, in a sense, a godsend to scholars, because it requires us to debate many things that otherwise might not be worth devoting our scholarship to. Yeah, obviously it does produce some anxiety and some tension as well. Sometimes variants can tell us even more about the relations between manuscripts. An interesting example of this is to be found in the manuscript remains of Njáls. There exist 27 or 28 paper transcripts of a lost medieval parchment that has been named Gyrtskinna, hypothetically, as you can see on the stemma here. And the stemma demands the assumption of at least 10 further paper copies of Gyrtskinna that are no longer to be found. Two of those extant paper transcripts are remarkably similar to each other, especially in the way they systematically differ from all the other paper witnesses to Gyrtskinna. The manuscripts are both in the Arnhem collection, manuscript 136 folio and 137 folio. The Icelandic scholar Mauri Jónsson in 1996 pointed out that precisely one manuscript line of text that is found in 136 is missing from 137. He concluded that 137 must be a copy of 136 on the assumption that the eye of the copyist of 137 skipped over a line in 136 as he was copying. This would render 137 of no textual authority if it simply copied from 136. For example, in Dárafjörður in Njáls saga, there appears the word bygde, the third person preterite plural of the verb bygja, meaning to settle. 136 instead has the word bygdim, which can only be first person plural or dative plural of the past participle of the same verb. 137 does not follow 136 in this regard. Likewise, in the 11th and final Loisha Visha, attributed to Skaldic Project, there appeared the word oath, meaning poetry, whereas several manuscripts, including 136 but not 137, read instead oath, meaning pointable weapon. It must be concluded then that 137 was not copied from 136, but that both are copied from a now lost manuscript, ultimately derived from Utskinna, probably at several removes. So on this basis, we can see that the witness of manuscript 137 is indeed worthy of consideration, since it's not simply a copy of 136. Knowing the stemma of the manuscripts of a given text is sometimes indispensable to choosing among the variant readings. An example is to be found in first Helmingur, or half stanza, of the 12th stanza of Sigvard Thorvaldsson's Berserkisvísur, meaning plain spoken verses. Some manuscripts read in the final line, Eichla, meaning intend. Pardon me, not the final line, the first line. Eichla, meaning intent, whereas others have a form in the middle voice. Eitlask, meaning intend for themselves. There being no substantive difference in meaning in the given context. All the major editions, including those of Finnur Jonsson, Ernst, Alvin Koch, and the Islandsk fourth edition, adopt the latter reading. But Kari Gade, in her edition, remarks that while Eitlask is possible, Eitla is preferable because it is higher up on the stemma. The stemma for manuscripts of Berserkisvísur is complicated, since this stanza of the poem is found in seven different texts, including Heimskringla, the separate saga of St. Olav, Ágrip of Norweg's Honungasaga, Fagerskinna, Hilda and Prochinskinna, Flateyrbok, and the third grammatical treatise. But in the most reliable manuscripts of most of these texts, the reading is Eichla, justifying Kari Gade's departure from the course chosen by previous editors. A somewhat clearer example is to be found in the 7th stanza of the Flokkur about Sveit Ufsson by Thorleifur Fagre. In the last line of the 2nd Helmingur, Kari Gade's edition has the word bilstikur, meaning hesitation shy, that is, undaunted. In her notes, she remarks, biltröður, hesitation reluctant, as Fagerskinna reads, is equally possible, but the manuscript witnesses show that it is secondary. The stemma, again, is complicated, since the stanza is preserved in Morkinskinna, Flateyrbok, Hilda Prochinskinna, Fagerskinna, and Heimskringla. But since the variant biltröður is found only in Fagerskinna, Kari was surely right to depart, surely right to regard biltröður as the less original form. It is so plainly a minority variant. As is true in Old Icelandic studies in general, as I've said, textual editing in the Skaldic Project is conservative, with a sole manuscript chosen as the main text, and variants from other manuscripts adopted only when there is good reason to depart from the readings of the main manuscript. This, in fact, is one of the defining characters of the editions of the Skaldic Project, since Finnur Jonsson, as I've remarked before, followed by other editors, not infrequently treated the witness of his manuscript sources somewhat cavalierly, amending at will, and the editors of the Skaldic Project regard this as one of the chief ills to be corrected in a new edition. On occasion, however, it is true that it is necessary to engage in conjectural emendation, adopting a reading found in none of the manuscript sources. And instances of this will be found even in the very conservative work of the Skaldic Project. An example is to be found in Kari Gada's edition of the poem about the Haraldir Halfraude by Valgardir Alvete. In the first line of first Helminger of the 11th stanza, none of the manuscript readings is viable. And following the lead of earlier editors, Kari Gada has supplied a different form altogether for an adequate reading. Beder, meaning layer or bed or quilt, is a masculine ya stem noun, and the regular accusative plural is bede. But the meter requires a long stem disyllabic word in positions 5 and 6, as it does in all Skaldic poetry. Bedia could be an archaic form, as Kari remarks. The emendation that does not seem improbable, since copyists very commonly substitute contemporary forms for archaic ones. A point that is illustrated very forcefully by Leonard Neidorff in his book, The Transmission of Beowulf, where he shows that the scribes of that manuscript, and presumably of other Old English poetic manuscripts, and presumably of other poetic traditions in the European Middle Ages, that they tended to copy word for word and not actually paying much attention to the context or the general sense of the text, and very frequently substituting a modern form for an archaic form that might have seemed puzzling to them. Are there any questions at this point?
Yeah, so you've mentioned a word in a couple of your publications, Sprachgefühl, this sort of feeling of a language that a scholar or a philologist acquires with reading. Is this a situation? I know in older classic studies, like 17th century-ish, scholars were so comfortable in Latin that they would amend manuscripts and texts just based on their own feeling for what should be happening there. Is this a situation in which we should be sort of relying on our instincts that we acquire through reading a lot of this poetry?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's a question that's been debated, particularly in Old English studies, and not so much in Old Icelandic studies, to my knowledge. For instance, E.G. Stanley once remarked that no matter what shortcomings we may attribute to Anglo-Saxon scribes, they knew the language much better than we do. It was their native language, and that is certainly true. He was arguing, of course, for retaining manuscript readings even when they look wrong to us. But that reasoning is not entirely reliable, is it? For instance, if as we know, scribes tended to update archaic forms and dialectal forms and put them into their own language, it's because they didn't recognize the forms in their exemplar. And we moderns are in a better position in some respects to judge that than medieval scribes were, because they were not philologists. They did not have a grasp of historical linguistics, whereas we do. So I don't think Stanley's reasoning is entirely reliable, but it's worth taking into account, and it's probably a great part of the rationale behind the conservatism that prevails in Old Norse studies in regard to manuscript readings. That is, the recognition that even though there are some aspects of the Old Icelandic language that we may understand better, for the most part, we have to recognize that the scribes themselves knew the language much better than we do. I think the problem is not quite as pressing in Old Icelandic studies as it is in Old English studies, because modern Icelandic is so similar to Old Icelandic, whereas modern English is so different from Old English. An example of choosing one's variants on the basis of the sense made by the text is to be found in the poem about Haraldir Harðráði by Illugi Bryndælaskál. In the first line of the first stanza, in agreement with prior editions, Kárigada has chosen the form Munir of the main manuscript of Snorre Edda, meaning, and Munir means pleasure. The majority of manuscripts, however, have a similar word, Munnur or Mur, meaning mouth. The choice of the meaning pleasure renders the sense of the first clause in the stanza as it was the pleasure of the wolf that my lord put many to flight. This makes fine sense and is quite a conventional image, implying that the wolf was pleased because it got its full of the slain. Some of the manuscripts that have the variant reading mouth show that the change of thoughts, meaning that, to thoughts, meaning there, where. The resulting sense of the clause is the mouth of the wolf was there where my lord put many to flight. That meaning is obviously not impossible, but it plainly makes inferior sense. And why the mouth of the wolf in particular should be mentioned is anything but obvious. But it is not. It is not a conventional Skaldic image. I think that's actually the most persuasive aspect of Kárigada's choice here. That is, we don't find a parallel kenning reference to the mouth of a wolf in Skaldic poetry, and so the pleasure of the wolf makes better sense in terms of the diction of Skaldic poetry. Another example may be observed in the final preserved stanza of Stúfsdrápa by the Icelandic poet Sturlurin Blindi Þórðarson Kaktar, in praise of King Haraldur Hárfagri. You probably noticed by now that a lot of Skaldic poetry is in praise of Haraldur. With previous editors, Kárigada has chosen the Hrokkinskinna reading for part of the intercalary clause in the second Helmingur, which in prose order would be Resaimaf Daimithesh, giving the meaning there are fitting proofs of that. The entire second Helmingur can then be translated later that prince fled neither fire nor pure iron. There are fitting proofs of that under the archiepiscopal seat of the storm, that is, under heaven. The reading of Morkinskinna and Huda is Ef Eresaim Daimithes, meaning if there are fitting proofs of that. But it makes little sense to make the phrase conditional, since that would seem to throw doubt on the king's valor, when the point of the poem is to praise him. So simply on the basis of sense, it makes sense to choose the reading of Hrokkinskinna. The second of the three factors I mentioned earlier in establishing the text is grammar, which is often decisive in establishing the most plausible form of the text. An example is in the first Helmingur of the same stanza of Stúfsdrápa that we just now examined. In line 4, the main manuscript, Morkinskinna, and two others, Huda and Færsinnabi, indicate the form orostur, meaning battles, which can only be feminine, nominative, or accusative plural. Yet the word is the object of the gögnum, a prepositional expression that demands a dative object. Accordingly, the form orostur, which is dative singular in form, is adopted from Hrokkinskinna. Grammar is also decisive in establishing the text of a Helmingur ascribed to King Haraldur Hárfagri, found only in a paper manuscript of about 1700 in the Royal Library in Copenhagen, designated 972X, and in Johan Peringshold's 1697 edition of Heimskringla, In both of these sources, the first two words of the stanza are given as reidhek, meaning I rode. There is really no way to fit this into either the sense or the grammar of the stanza. On the other hand, as Karagada notes in her edition, the infinitive standa in the fourth line requires an auxiliary verb to make grammatical sense. The phrase reidhek resembles the phrase vriethjek, meaning literally I decided, though the verb is frequently used simply as a colorless auxiliary. She contracts reidhje to the monosyllable reethk, which is metrically preferable in a relatively early composition like this. They're not strictly necessary. The stanza can then be rendered, I stood in battle and the wounds bled. I saw farmers strengthen their host. The distress of the linden shield, that is the sword, dealt death. Although we are perhaps in the habit of thinking of grammar as equivalent to morphosyntax, it includes other aspects of language, including phonology. And phonology does sometimes play a role in establishing the text. An example is to be found in the two-line kviðlingur, or ditty, of Stegar Þórir Þórðarson, once a retainer of Haraldur Hárráði, as edited by Karagada. The first person preterite plural of the verb to be normally has a long vowel, varum, later vaurum. In the first word of this poem, however, the vowel must be short or the reader will be spoiled. The word is unstressed, and in order for the two syllables of the verb to fill an unstressed position, both vowels must be short, so that the word can be neutralized, to use Karagada's terminology. Nearly a century and a half ago, Eduard Zifas pointed out that although the meter of Skaldic poetry attests to a long root vowel in this word when it is in a stressed position, in unstressed position it is short. This makes excellent phonological sense, since the vowels of unstressed syllables are very commonly shortened or even deleted. For instance, compare the treatment of the vowel in the English word is, which is when it is unstressed, as in the sentence, what's new, and when it is stressed, as in the sentence, I don't know what it is. A knowledge of Old Icelandic language history in general is an essential element in the editor's toolkit. An example of the role it plays can be seen in Jane Carroll's edition of Markus Skeggjason's poem Eiríks Drápa, in honor of King Eirík Sveinsson of Denmark, composed sometime around 1100. This was published in volume 2 of the Skaldic Project under Karagada's editorship. Following earlier editors with Karagada's advice, Jane Carroll has made two conjectural emendations in the first line of the second Helmingur of stanza 30, where all the manuscripts read Ógnin stóð, meaning the terror was inspired. But this is implausible in a poem of about 1100, since Ógnin consists of the noun ógn, meaning plus the definite article in. And this is too early for the use of the suffix definite article in verse. This is an innovation in Icelandic. You just don't find it in early poems. Of course, it's standard in the modern language, but not in the earliest forms of the Old Icelandic language. As you know, spelling in the manuscripts is quite variable. For example, in the next line of this same stanza, there appears the verb strengja in the phrase strengja kapp, meaning test one's strength. In 3 manuscripts, the verb is spelt with an EI diphthong. Because the language was changing over the course of the 5 centuries during which Skaldic poetry was composed, Karagada divided those centuries into 4 periods with different spelling standards for the normalization of the text, and is stipulated in the introduction to each text which standard of normalization has been applied to it. In this instance, the 14th century spelling has been changed, to the 11th century one. That is, the EI diphthong, as it would be pronounced in the 14th century, has been reduced simply to an E. The last of the three factors I mentioned earlier in helping to establish the text is poetic form, including meter, alliteration, and rhyme. Meter guides Carey's editorial choice in regard to the second Helmingur of the first stanza of the Magnus Draupa of Þorgerd Hammarskjöld in honor of the Norwegian king Magnus Berfættur, meaning barefoot, who died in 1103. And I should say that Carey was the world's leading authority on the meters of Old Norse poetry. Karagada points out that the meter in line 5 demands stress on the word au. Normally, au is a preposition, but since it is stressed, here it must be an adverb. You're familiar with this same phenomenon in Old English. In prose order, the wording in her edition is Frau snor mein en drau, which means I heard the great harm formerly was present. The assumption here is that there is a suppressed form of the verb to be, and the phrase vera au means be present. Prior editors, including Finnur Jonsson Koch and the editors of the Isländsk Forn edition, all instead treat au as a preposition, making frauk snor mein au því, meaning I heard great harm from it. That is, I heard great harm resulted from it. But as Carey points out, the meter rules out the use of au as a preposition. A different sort of metrical consideration must be taken into account in connection with the first Helmingur of the 7th stanza of State Herdísarsson's Ólafsdrápa in honor of King Olav Kyrre, meaning the quiet, from the second half of the 11th century. In line 4, Finnur Jonsson and the editors of the Isländsk Forn edition treat the parenthetic clause as comprising just the first two words, Hans Ríkur, meaning he is powerful. And they construe the third word, Jöður, meaning prince, with the first clause of the stanza, where it is qualified by so strongar, meaning battle strong. The problem, however, as Karagada points out in her notes, is that in a line of this metrical type containing a parenthetic clause, the sentence boundary must fall not after position 2, which would fall on the word ríkir in line 4 here, but after position 4, a principle she discovered and explained in her 1995 book on Druckrecht poetry. I should add that including the word jöður in the parenthetic clause also has the virtue of simplifying the syntax of the Helmingur. In addition to meter, alliteration may play a role in editorial decisions. In line 3 of the first of the Lausavísir ascribed to King Magnus Berfættur Ólafsson, Karagada has adopted the reading hoof of the main manuscript, a word she renders as hull in reference to the middle planks between the stem and the stern of a ship. The intercalary clause thus may be rendered, I let the flexible hull climb the breakers. In 2 manuscripts, there is the reading kjöl, meaning keel, instead of hoof, and that makes perfectly good sense. However, as Carey points out, kjöl produces a line with 3 alliterating staves. Snorri Sturluson tells us explicitly in Snorri Edda, in the first chapter of Háttatal, that there must be precisely 3 alliterating staves in each pair of lines, and any more or fewer is a poetic fault. So obviously, the reading hoof is to be preferred to kjöl. Rhyme is also an important aspect that needs to be taken into consideration when establishing the text. A straightforward example is to be found in Karagada's edition of the second of 2 preserved stanzas of a poem by Germanic about Haraldur Hárfagri. Lines 3 to 4 of the first Helmingur can be translated, I believe the ruler prepared a Yule feast for the retinue of Hugin by Tholarnesh. Hugin is the name of one of Odin's ravens, pardon me. Um, the retinue of Hugin then being, you'll never guess, ravens. Um, the reading of the main manuscript, Morkinskinna, instead of Hirth, meaning retinue, has Hrith, meaning storm. Hugin's storm is not a familiar kenning, and at any rate, the form Hirth is required by the internal half-rhyme with the word Gerði. What Kari Goddess says she has done is adopt the form in Morkinskinna, but amended it to Hirth. Hirth is the actual reading of two manuscripts of Snorre Edda, but Kari presumably did not rely on them because they are farther down on the stemma, and the reading appears to be a scribal innovation intended to correct the rhyme. This discussion has focused on the many different varieties of philological expertise required to establish the text. There is, of course, much more than that to what the editors of the Skaldic Project must do as they prepare their editions. They must rewrite the text in a prose order consistent with Icelandic usage. They must translate the text into English, hewing as close to the Icelandic prose order as is feasible. They must identify all the manuscripts consulted, indicating the relevant folios and the prose texts from which the poetry is usually drawn. They must indicate what variant readings are to be found in the manuscripts, distinguishing between substantive differences and mere spelling variants. They must indicate what editions of the poetry have appeared previously. They must explain the context in which the poetry appears, usually a prose text, and indicate what purpose the poetry serves in that context. And they must compile explanatory notes explaining, helping the reader to understand the poetry and why it is edited the way it is. At the outset, I said that one way of viewing philology is as an aggregate of the various modes of inquiry required for the editing of texts in extinct languages. I hope I have sufficiently demonstrated the immense variety of kinds of expertise required of the philologist. I'm sure you can imagine that acquiring those many kinds of skills is a lifetime work. I think that in itself is one of the greatest tribute to the memory of Kari Gada. She had mastered so much of what a philologist needs to know to be an effective editor. So are there any questions?
Yes, I think the last thing I want to ask is, when we think about languages, how important do you think it is for the philologist of, say, Old English or Old Norse to know languages like German, modern Icelandic, Latin, perhaps even ancient Greek? At what sort of goal should they be shooting for in terms of these other languages?
Well, it depends on what kind of work is being undertaken. If you are doing research in Germanic philology of any kind, it is really necessary to be able to read German, because so much of the philological work of the 19th century was done by German scholars. In fact, there was more than a little resentment in England about how medieval English texts had come to be the province of German scholars rather than English scholars, who were unfortunately many of them opposed to philological methods. Um, if you are doing Old Norse studies, of course, it is essential that you be able to read Danish, um, although Norwegian and Swedish are also helpful. But if you can read Danish, you can probably make your way through a Swedish or a Norwegian text. Um, when I was living in Denmark, I remember I made a trip to Norway, and on the way back, I bought a Norwegian novel to read. It had actually been translated from English, But Norwegian is so similar to Danish, I had no trouble reading it without a dictionary on the way back to Copenhagen. Um, as for Latin, yes, it's essential that you be able to decipher text in Latin. Um, so much of the uh, context of vernacular texts in the Middle Ages is in Latin. Um, uh, that it really is necessary. And of course, it is also helpful to be aware that for many scribes in the Middle Ages, the vernacular language was not the language they normally were copying in, but they were copying in Latin. And their scribal habits in Latin texts may be taken over to their vernacular texts. As for Greek, um, it's rarely of considerable use in in the study of, for instance, Old English. Although, for instance, uh, if you are studying texts that are somehow related to the traditions of Theodore and Hadrian of Canterbury, um, uh, a knowledge of Greek is sometimes useful. What Greek is much more useful for is the historical, the aspect of Germanic philology that is concerned with historical linguistics, because Greek is so very helpful in helping to establish the prehistory of the Germanic languages. The vowels of Greek are very conservative in comparison to most other Indo-European languages. And so the evidence of Greek in that respect is very helpful. The consonants of Greek are also helpful, though not quite as helpful as the consonants of Sanskrit. Um, and so at I'm not saying that one has to be fluent in Greek or Sanskrit, but at least knowing the essentials of those languages is really a prerequisite for the historical uh, for the study of the history of the early Germanic languages. Are there any languages I didn't cover that I should address?
I don't know. Professor Fulk, thank you very much for coming on the channel.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This has been most enjoyable.